You're just a great friend. What's up with that? It's when you work really hard on a job and somebody else gets the promotion. Or you worked really hard preparing a dinner and no one seems to care, maybe not even notice your effort. Any mom ever been there? Or you study for a test but you don't get the grade. You work hard at practice but you still sit on the bench. It's that feeling when you turn on ESPN and your team is out of the playoffs because of a dropped pass. Good morning, Eagles fans. Anybody know who's playing in the Super Bowl today and who isn't? You know what, but it's much more than that. And we can laugh about trivial discouragements. But it's the feeling you get when the test results come back and the cancer has spread. It's when your spouse says, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. It's going to the mailbox and finding another shutoff notice. Yeah, discouragement is very real. Discouragement is a word that's kind of funny because it's described as a feeling. It's hard to explain words that are described as a feeling, but most of us really don't need the word discouragement defined. It's that feeling of losing hope, of losing courage. You get discouraged, you had hope, now you're losing it. You had courage and strength, but it's slipping away. And you're not sure how much longer you can keep on going. You're not sure how much longer you can hang on. And you're starting to feel defeated. Discouragement isn't something you can point to. It's something, though, as if it had weight and mass. You can't say, there's my discouragement. But it's something that can hold you back and weigh you down. Last Sunday, we started to talk about the stuff that gets in the way of our Christian walk. And discouragement is one of those things. So we're challenged to overcome the discouragements in life. Last Sunday, we looked at the life of Joseph to learn to deal with temptation. Today, let's see how he handled discouragement. Because Joseph's life was much like yours and mine. It had many ups and downs. We said last Sunday that Joseph's mom, her name was Rachel, died in childbirth of his youngest brother, Benjamin. Joseph was about 10 when that happened. Tough growing up without the encouragement and support of a mom. His older brothers, by the way, all who were half-brothers, were jealous of him, and they did their best to tear him down. Eventually, we remember they sold him into slavery. They told their father Jacob that he had died, even showed him some bloody clothing. Seems Joseph had some problems with clothing, right? Joseph was 17 when he was sold into slavery. Remember, he was sold to a man named Potiphar and taken to a foreign land. Now he's nothing more than property. He has no value more than property. But we remember from last Sunday, Genesis chapter 39, that God was with Joseph. That God can be with you even if you're a slave. And God gave Joseph success in that position as a slave. And he grew to a place where he was in charge of all of Potiphar's household. Sounds like a pretty cool life. Except for enter the cougar. Potiphar's wife takes notice of Joseph and she makes these sexual advances towards him. And Joseph resisted and Mrs. Potiphar, she persisted. Eventually, he tried not even to be in the same room with her. So she tells her husband that Joseph tried to rape her, shows him a piece of clothing. How's that for a charge against you? Your property in a foreign land. And you're charged with the attempted rape of the master's wife. Joseph can't defend himself. A slave's word against his master's wife. So he's thrown into a dungeon. No trial, no appeal process, no release date. He was thrown in dungeon like a tin can that we might throw in the garbage. He was thrown there to die. And Joseph certainly could have been discouraged. He was a slave, then he was the head of the household, now he's a prisoner. And if we put our hope in our circumstances, if we put our hope in our situation, then I got to tell you, we're probably going to be discouraged a time or two. Let's pick up in Genesis chapter 39 and verses 20 and 21. It says, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. God allowed Joseph to prosper in prison right in his situation. Most of us would think, well, as soon as I get out of prison, then I can prosper again. Here God allowed Joseph to prosper just where he was. Joseph gets some purpose, he gets some meaning, even in his circumstance. So Genesis chapter 40 and verse 1 begins this way. It says, sometime later, Joseph had been in prison for a while. That's sometime later. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. We're not told what they did, but they offended him. But these two high-ranking officials are thrown into the same prison as Joseph. Genesis 40, 44 and 5. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream, both of them on the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Please notice the time passing as we wear our discouragement on our face, right? Why do you look so sad today? Why are you upset? Here's what they say in verses 9 to 13. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup in his hand. Joseph says, okay, I got it. Verse 12, this is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to do when you were the cupbearer. Joseph told him, it's going to be better for you in 3 days. Your circumstance, your situation is going to change in 3 days. And it's getting better. Verses 14 and 15. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. And even here, I've done nothing to deserve being in a dungeon. So Joseph says, I'll help you. Here's what your dream means. Just remember me in 3 days. Here's how the story continues at verses 16 to 19. When the chief cupbearer saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds of the air were eating them out of the basket on my head. Joseph says, I got this one too. This is what it means. The 3 baskets are 3 days. The baker has got to think, so far so good. In 3 days, the other guy, he's going to do okay. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head. See, the word off really changes the meaning of the dream here. The cupbearer, he gets his head lifted up. The baker, he gets his head lifted off. And, let me finish. He's going to impale your body on a pole and the birds will eat your flesh. And the baker's got to be saying, say what? Wait a minute. It seems like we kind of had the same dream. This guy gets his head lifted up. I get my head lifted off. And Joseph said, yeah, sorry. Sometimes words fail you, right? Did you ever see that, though, how that happens in life? Where some people, everything seems to work out. And then it comes to us, and we go, off? Did you really say off? Wow. And in 3 days, it all happened just as Joseph said. The cupbearer is restored, and the baker, well, he becomes bird food. That's not a pleasant thought. But here's how the chapter ends. Chapter 40 ends this way in verse 23. It says, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Man, that's got to be discouraging. Man, I helped this guy. I interpreted his dream. And he forgot me. He's been a slave in prison. He's been waiting for this kind of opportunity. It seems God has given him this opportunity. He interprets the dream. The interpretations of the dream come true. Let me ask you, anybody ever correctly predict what's going to happen in the future? Rick, that the Phillies will lose, don't count. Seriously, this is a God thing. The cupbearer forgets Joseph. Pretty tough not to be discouraged, right? His brothers sold him, told his dad he was dead. They forgot him, and now the cupbearer, who he just did a favor for, he forgets about him too. I think the question is, though, did God forget about him? And maybe that's the question some of us are bringing here today. Maybe we've personalized it and are asking, did God forget about me? It's been a long time, God. I've been in this prison, so to speak, for a while now. Last Sunday we looked at Genesis chapter 39, and we read 4 times the phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. It says it 4 times. 4 times! Maybe that's for us. Because as we learn about Joseph, we start to remember and we start to wonder and say, well, is the Lord really with him? Because to us, it may not seem like God is with him. Slavery in prison and forgotten by the cupbearer. Yeah, it looks like the Lord's with him, right? And it would be easy to assume that God isn't with him if you're just looking at his circumstances. If that's how you look for God's presence, by circumstances, well, then maybe you're going to be discouraged. Or maybe we ought to personalize this when we're rejected and when we're discouraged and say, the Lord is with me. And isn't that his promise? Scripture's not on the screen. It's Hebrews 13:5. We know it by heart, at least the last part. It says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Be content with what you have. Because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Not even after a long time. But we got to claim that truth. For Christians, God is not only with us, he is in us. That's our hope. And that hope won't disappoint us. And if we put our hope in our situations or our circumstances, we're going to feel discouraged. So we remind ourselves again and again that the Lord is with us. Maybe we should remind ourselves 4 times. What do you think? 4 seems like a good number, right? Folks, in those moments when you can feel things getting out of control, in those moments when you seem to be in a free fall, you got to tell yourself who God really is. That God is with you. And that you have an enemy that's trying to tell you the opposite, that God has forgotten you, that God has abandoned you, that you're not part of God's plan, that, well, you missed the boat here a little bit. Remember the promises. Remember the truth. There's a lot of lies going on out there. I feel forgotten. I feel rejected. But how about the truth? The truth is God is with me. Sometimes we feel like the east coast of the United States, one hurricane after another. You get over one storm and another one comes. You get done with a problem with one kid and there's a problem with kid number 2. You finally figure out this part of your marriage. And then another part becomes a struggle. And it can be at work, a few steps forward, a few steps back. The first storm, you just get cleaned up and here comes another one. It's like we're Florida. And over time you feel discouraged. Let me tell you a story of someone and a hurricane. Let me tell you Rowena's story. Rowena Duplessis was a survivor of Hurricane Katrina several years back. USA Today told her story. Rowena lost her home and everything in it in Hurricane Katrina. 6 months prior to Katrina, she suffered through the death of her husband. A year ago, her son committed suicide. She got a trailer after Katrina, and robbers broke in and stole everything of value that she had accumulated a second time. She was now afraid to live there alone. USA Today said this. They said, like many Katrina survivors, Rowena says her faith in God only grows stronger. USA Today. And then they wrote this quote. She says, this is what sustains me. When it's really bad, you put it in his hands, in God's hands. You do what you're able to do, and you have faith that he can and will do the rest. He carried me on many days when I couldn't walk or even stand myself. That was the thing in quotation marks in the article. Here's what her counsel is when you feel discouraged, do what you can and count on God to do the rest. And how's that for a story in USA Today? How's that for a witness? Just a Christian lady who lost it all, as it appeared. And that's what Joseph does. Joseph doesn't wilt back in discouragement and bitterness over the hand that he's been dealt. He steps into it. He takes advantage of the opportunities that each day has, and he helps other people around him. I wonder, when we're discouraged, can we separate ourselves from our own discouragement enough to help the folks around us? Joseph even asked people for help. We don't ask people for help, right? I won't even ask for directions. I'll drive around for hours and try and find the place before I'll stop and ask. GPS systems have caused me to sin less. The Bible says the Lord was with Joseph 4 times. Why? Why the reminder 4 times? Because sometimes in our circumstance, we don't believe it. We want the story to say, and Joseph was released from prison and given a full public apology, and Mrs. Potiphar was punished for lying, and Joseph lived happily ever after. But not now, not here, not yet. Here's something I think we need to learn about God. God is more concerned at what is happening in us than what is happening to us. Maybe better said, he's more concerned that what happens to us accomplishes something in us. As we progress in this series, we'll see how God was at work in Joseph's life, and what was happening to him was accomplishing something in him. God was at work the whole time. It seemed as if God had abandoned Joseph, but in fact, it was all part of a plan to develop Joseph. God knew there were some things that needed to happen to Joseph in order to accomplish some things through Joseph. Maybe we can put our name in there. God knew there were some things that needed to happen to Steve in order to accomplish some things through Steve. And yet Joseph's trauma goes on and on. It lasts a long time. We can do the math here if you'd like. Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold as a slave. He was 30 years old when we'll see next week he finally gets out of prison. Anybody do the math? Brian, put your shoes back on. He got past 10 and he started taking his shoes off. 13 years. Anybody think 13 years is a pretty long time? And that's what discouragement looks like. You're handed this weight and you can deal with it for a while. I can deal with being a slave. I can deal with being a prisoner for a while. But the longer you carry the weight, the heavier it seems to get. And you reach a point where you say, I don't know if I can keep carrying this thing. And the days turn into years, and it feels a little bit too much. But when you have hope, you believe it's all going to work out. But God is never going to give you too much. When they train you in counseling, they tell you never to say that to people. It's all going to work out. When you go into a prison, when you go into a hospital room, you don't say, well, it's all going to work out. Because it sounds patronizing and it sounds trivializing. And people don't want to hear that when they have this weight around them. Hey, it's all going to work out. See you later. Have a nice day. And it doesn't seem helpful. But here's the reality. It's not necessarily a truth that you want to hear from somebody else. You better remind yourself of that truth. Romans 8:28 says it this way, and we know that in all things God works for good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. You got to say that to you. It's going to work out on one side of eternity or the next. If you're faithful with what God gives you, if you love him, it's going to work out for the good. And when we see this, everything is going to work out, maybe the first thing you ask is, well, how, God? Maybe that's what you ask. I think here's what you ask. I think more likely you say, when? When is it going to work out? When is it going to stop being an issue? When are we going to figure things out? When are we going to have to stop going to that hospital? When? Folks, discouragement starts to set in when not yet starts to seem like not ever. It's the waiting that's the hard work in fighting discouragement. And we're not good at waiting. Nobody chooses waiting. You go to the grocery store and you choose the checkout line with the most people because you just need to wait today. Says no one. You get in line and you see the person in front of you start to reach for their checkbook like it's 1985, and you think, right now I just love waiting. This is just great. Am I the only one who struggles with cutting through the gas stations on the corner to avoid the traffic light? I did that for years. I'm trying not to do it anymore. I think I need to set a better example. But you come up to the light and the light is red and it's right there. You just go from here to here. And it makes sense to me. And I find myself doing it again. Because truth be told, we just don't like to wait. But this waiting is the hard work in fighting discouragement. It's the waiting that's difficult. But it's in the waiting that God is accomplishing his purpose in you. Waiting is part of the process. What God is doing in you while you're waiting is necessary to your destination. And if you look around God's waiting room, you'll see people in there, people who have been waiting for a while. I know a couple waiting to conceive for 89 months, as the wife describes it. You know how babies, they say when they're born, you're 13 months and 24 months. And she describes her waiting period as 89 months. Anybody want to do the math there? I'll help you. That's over 7 years. And they were there first, and their name still hasn't been called. Darren's been without a job for more than a year, and he helps others as he waits. And God was with him. And in the end, he simply found courage in that. In 1905, the song, "His Eye is on the Sparrow," was written by a pastor's wife known simply as Mrs. Martin. Seems there was a lady in their church, her name was Mrs. Doolittle, and they would go see her from time to time and they would try and encourage her. Seems they would always leave feeling more encouraged. Mrs. Doolittle had been bedridden for more than 20 years and her husband was crippled and confined to a wheelchair. On a particular visit, Pastor Martin is hopeful. How she fought off discouragement. What was the secret to her joy? And Mrs. Doolittle didn't preach a sermon. Her reply was very simple. She simply referenced the teaching of Jesus from Matthew chapter 10, verse 29. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of the Father's care. And she said with a smile, if his eye is on the sparrow, then I know he's got to be watching after me. Pastor Martin's wife heard that from Mrs. Doolittle, and she was humbled, and she was inspired, and she went home and she thought of all the things in her own life that discourage her. And she sat down and wrote a song. And the first words, why do you feel discouraged? Why do you feel discouraged? And she begins to remind herself of this wonderful hope we have in Jesus, a hope that doesn't disappoint. I'd ask Carol and Brenda to please remind us of that today as we close, and then we'll finish with prayer. Carol?
my portion, my constant friend is He. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. Whenever I am tempted, whenever clouds arise, when songs give place to sighing, when hope within me dies, I draw the closer to Him. From care He sets me free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. For His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches